This is the committee meeting on personnel and human development.
Okay.
And I'll introduce the council, and then I'll ask our guest to introduce himself. I'm Councilor Lovejoy-Brunel. We have Councilor Thompson, Councilor Green, President Hudson, Councilor Rudd, Councilor Bay, Councilor Allen, and Councilor Driscoll here. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Councilor Lovejoy-Brunel. I am John Capanis. I'm the city clerk of the City of Syracuse.
Thank you.
You seem nervous, Mr. Clerk.
And we're here to hear testimony from you regarding a possible pay raise for council, mayor, and the city auditor.
Right. I've been here for many years as city clerk, and I was involved with all the other previous pay raises. That the auditor last time was raised in 1999. Mayor was 2008, and the council was 2001 when legislation was taken to raise the salaries. So I wanted to take a look at the big 5 cities, which we are a member of, and I gave you a handout sheet, and there's one here for the public that shows what those salaries are for councilors, for mayors, what the size of the cities are, you know, and what they pay. And there's no question that Syracuse is really out of line and way too low in all categories, the mayor, the Common Council, and the auditor. So given this research, which I did with your staff member, Jim Conroy, we worked together, we came up with a proposal, we discussed a proposal to try to remedy that and get it more in line with the other cities. Albany, which is smaller than Syracuse, for example, I'll use that as an example, there are 100,000 people approximately, we're approximately 145. That mayor of Albany makes 135,000, and the mayor of Syracuse makes 115,000, just as an example. Council seats, we're at 21,224. Yonkers, $48,000 for just a councilor. Majority Minority Leader, $58,000. Council President, $79,000. Rochester, $35,000 for council members. Council President, $45,000. Mayor, $150, $149. And then I also looked at the county legislature because it's a nearby legislative body, and frankly, they meet only once a month. We meet on average twice a month, and their most recent salary is at $31,075. So, given this analysis, you know, that's where I believe the proposal, you know, that's been discussed is how it was derived.
I have a couple questions. I see that the City of Rochester, as well as the Onondaga County Legislature, both fix their local legislation fix the salaries with automatic increases that are tied to some CPI or maybe some other mechanism. What do you see as the advantages and disadvantages of tying in our legislation, which to be clear, has not yet been drafted, and this committee meeting is designed to inform that process of drafting. What do you think the benefits and costs would be of tying it to some measure like that?
I was asked to look into that question, and I've asked the Corporation Counsel's office to check with the county attorney, and they're in the process of doing that, to find out how the county legislature tied their salary going forward, and to give you the options of what's available. When we did this in 2001 for both ourselves, for the council, and in 1999 for the auditor, we had a 3-year 2% cost of living increase. So it only went out 3 years. So you guys started at 20,000, and that's why you're at 21,224, is because it went out 3 years. The auditor started at 50,000, now they're at 53 and change because of that 3 years. At that time, we were advised to do it over that amount of time. Now, I don't know if there was other options, and that's what we're researching with the law department, to find out all your options so that when you do draft legislation, you can determine it. Some would argue the merits of that are that you don't have to come back and it keeps pace with the cost of living. Others would say that, you know, every so often the council should revisit its own salary. So there's pros and cons on that.
Could you similarly discuss the costs, the benefits, the advantages, disadvantages of tying all salaries together, which hasn't historically been done? Obviously, there have been different. The mayor's salary has increased a different year than the councilor's salary has increased. What are the benefits that you see of tying all of those roles, councilor, auditor, and mayor, together in one package?
Well, actually, in 2001, it was proposed as one package, but it didn't advance that way. the outgoing mayor, Mayor Bernardi, was interested in having a retroactive raise because he was leaving, and the council wasn't interested in going retroactive, so it was dropped. So there was one other time when they were grouped together, but didn't pass together. So I think that the council's purview under the charter is to look at public official salaries. That's your responsibility. And I think looking at these, they're all out of whack, and it just makes sense to deal with them all at the same time. It also makes sense because we're at the end of a term, new people are coming on, and in the case of the mayor, we're not proposing until his whatever term of the next person comes for the mayor goes on, so that it's pretty fair that you're doing it at a time when there's a break in office.
Other questions?
I'm just curious to know, because I'm with Councilor Lovejoy Donnell, that I look to see that Rochester did it to go with the CPI index, which is what most companies do anyway, is 2% every year for their employees. So I mean, it kind of to me basically is the same thing, correct?
That's correct. This, by the way, this proposal would put you as if your 2% had continued forward. If it didn't stop after 3 years, this is where you would end up being. That's another justification for this dollar amount. But Mr. Barry, could you explain what you're researching on this so that the council can have a more detailed explanation of CPI?
Good afternoon, Joe Barry, First Assistant Corporation Counsel. The change in compensation under municipal home rule laws done through what we call a local law. As you know, you've dealt with those in the past. The difference is my reading, and I've just started the research, so it's not conclusive yet, is that a local law for compensating elected officials is subject to what's called the permissive referendum, which is similar to a mandatory referendum, but different in that it's triggered by the voters submitting petitions. So once this item is on your agenda, 10% of the city electorate could petition through the city clerk to make this a referendum, and it would have to go to the next general election if the proper number of signatures were submitted. How that relates to the CPI is, as the city clerk mentioned, we've done increases into the future in the past, but they've been 2 or 3 years into the future. If you have an automatic increase that goes on, in theory, in perpetuity, you would be potentially denying the voters their ability to request a referendum on that subject, because there would be only the original local law. There would be no subsequent legislation ratifying those future increases. And that's the issue I need to further look into, because as you mentioned, some other municipalities have apparently done this, and I believe the county has done it as well.
Maybe it would be helpful for you to explain more. You kind of jumped in there at the CPI explanation, but for you to explain a little bit more about, you mentioned the need for it to be a local law, and you mentioned a little bit about the tabling, or you alluded to that process. Could you describe more of the process that we would need to go through were we to propose such legislation, and what that process would be from now until adoption?
In terms of the local law process?
Yes.
Yes. So a local law has to be either drafted in final form and presented to the council 7 days before a vote, or what we more commonly do is have it introduced at a first meeting and then automatically table it to the second meeting to make sure that waiting period is adequately taken care of. Upon a positive vote by the council, it then requires a public hearing by the chief executive, in our case, the mayor, and the city clerk arranges with the mayor's office the time and place of that public hearing. Upon the public hearing, the mayor approves or disapproves, then it can be filed with the Secretary of New York State to become effective.
So if this were to be on our next meeting agenda, when would be the earliest that this could be voted on? No matter when the law took effect, but when would this be would be the earliest that it could be adopted?
Voted on by the council?
Yes.
December 2nd.
Okay.
Just a question for clarity, and maybe you can look into this, Mr. Barry. You mentioned chief executive. Well, if I'm not mistaken, the municipal home rule identifies the council president as the chief executive here. How do you differentiate and how do you qualify which one it's referring to?
Yeah, so sections 20 and 21 of the municipal home rule law deal with this process specifically.
Okay.
And in that context, it's a law of application across many municipalities. So in some local governments, you have especially towns where the town supervisor is the executive, but also sits on the town board and votes.
Right. That's kind of my point, because that's not the case here, so.
Yeah, so within one of those sections, 20 or 21, it distinguishes the fact of when municipalities have an independently elected chief executive, as we do with the mayor, that they're referring to the mayor's position for the purposes of local laws, and that's always been our practice.
I mean, I understand that that's been the practice, but I don't know if that differentiates anymore, right? Because can't have two chief executives, obviously, and so, but I know for a fact that it identifies the president as a chief executive officer of the chamber.
Yeah, but so I can see your point, but the city charter is allowed to deviate somewhat from state law. So we have a mayor-council form of government.
Right.
The city charter specifically says that the mayor is the chief executive and runs the day-to-day affairs of the city. The council president presides over the council
Chamber, right.
chamber as the legislative body. But that's it's clear that the mayor is the chief executive for the entire city in terms of city operations.
Yeah, I'm not calling into question the title of the mayor as it relates to the city. I'm speaking specifically to the operation of the chamber and the whole legislative process over which the mayor is not the chief executive officer. That's
correct, and I think it's the fact that New York State municipal home rule law uses the terminology chief executive is confusing. And I think they just do that because they're trying to lump in mayors, county executives, and supervisors, because it applies to all those organizations across the board with different forms of chief executive.
Yeah, we may have to talk about that a little more, because speaking for me, I'm no more clear on how one trumps the other, especially when you have separation of powers. We know we have a mayor-strong form of government. That's qualified by the mayor's ability or discretion to negotiate and enter contracts, and his discretion with spending. That's what makes us a mayor-strong form of government. Those actions, right? Those are things that we can't do.
Well, in day-to-day direction of departments, how they operate.
Right.
But,
and again, just to re-mention, it wasn't calling into question who was the chief executive as it relates to the management of the city and its operations. The language was specific to the legislative chamber when referred to as the chief executive. I get the point that the charter, I guess has some wiggle room. I guess maybe even that has to be clarified, just how much wiggle room and at what point as it gets to wiggle. But I don't know. I still, at least for me, I haven't heard anything that clearly explains how one's chief executive in a separate branch of government is somehow nullified or suspended, depending on subject matter. I didn't see anything like that in there that spoke, at least that clear. I didn't. It doesn't mean it's not there, but I didn't see it.
again, I think for the local law process, the state law is clear on how the city legislative body votes on it and then sends it to the mayor for a public hearing
Right.
and his approval.
Right.
As the city clerk can attest, the forms that are filled out to send to the Department of State, you have to indicate, whether it was approved by both the legislative body and the mayor, and then if the mayor
Right.
does choose to veto it, the legislative body can override that, and the form reflects that when it goes to the state. So there's the state is acknowledging that that's the process for a city such as ours. Whereas the council president, certifies that this body has adopted the local law in its final form. So the council president, as she does with all legislation, is certifying what is adopted and sent to the mayor for his approval.
Any more questions for Mr. Barry?
I'll discuss that with you further later.
Anytime, thank you.
Just before we open it up and to clarify, we will have a period for public comment. There'll be 2 minutes per person. But before we get to that, Mr. Kapanis, could you describe the budget impact of this potential legislation?
Right. Well,
that's proposed?
this legislation, as proposed, it could be modified, suggests that it starts, because the new council starts on January 1, and the new auditor starts on January 1, that would be when it starts. As you know, we're on a fiscal year that's June to July to June. So in the first year, it would only affect 6 months of the current budget we're in, so that's less than $50,000 for the auditor and the council members. Then after that, a full year would be, if you do a full year for the council and the audit, it's $97,000, just under $100,000. And then you don't factor in the mayor's increase because it won't happen until after the mayor's election. So then, again, it'll be first a 6-month increase and then a full year's increase, and that would add another $7,500 1 year, half year, and then $15,000. So it phases in over multiple budgets, so it's not a hit to one budget.
Are there more questions for Mr. Kapanis at this time? All right. So, Amanda? No? Okay. So, okay, then we will close the committee unless there's any other questions or witnesses anyone else would like to call. No? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're closed.